I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project here at the Brooklyn Commons. We run events such as this, class series on related topics and other topics of interest to activists and scholars and participants in social movements, providing non-sectarian Marxist framework for understanding the world in the 21st century and the history of how we got here. There are flyers at the table, and I'll mention a few of the upcoming events later on. But tonight our topic is the new, recently issued book edited by Jason W. Moore, Anthropocene or Capitalocene. There are copies available at the table, and Jason and Christian will be available to autograph books at the end of the evening. Jason Moore is a historical geographer and world historian at Binghamton University, where he works with the Fernand Braudel Center and teaches sociology. He's author of Capitalism and the Web of Life and several other works, related works. And is currently completing a book called Ecology and the Rise of Capitalism, and a book with Raj Patel called 7 Cheap Things, A World Ecological Manifesto. And many of his essays can be found on his website, www.jasonwmoore.com. Christian Parenti teaches at New York University in the Global Liberal Studies program, author most recently of Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change, and the New Geography of Violence. As a journalist, he reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, and parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and has published in The Nation, Fortune, London Review of Books, the New York Times, and many other publications. He has a PhD in sociology and geography from the London School of Economics. The format tonight will be Jason will speak for about 20 minutes, then Christian for about 20 minutes. Then we'll have a kind of a conversation and dialogue here for a little bit, and then we'll throw it open to your questions and comments. Thank you very much. Jason W. Moore.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you, Fred and Steve and everyone else for making this happen tonight. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you to my comrade Christian for being part of this dialogue. As you can see from the book, Christian's own pioneering thinking about the environmental making state, which you'll talk more about, has been quite inspiring to me and is part of the ongoing reinvention of Marxism and the critique of capitalism as a world ecology of power, capital, and nature. So we need to think about the Anthropocene, the age of man. The Anthropocene is the most influential, the most popular, and I think also the most dangerous environmentalist concept of our times. It isn't dangerous because it's insights about the biosphere, because its insights about state shifts and tipping points in the planetary system are wrong. That is all well and good. It is dangerous because in its popular incarnation, the Anthropocene, like so much of environmentalist thought, has been a way to avoid naming the system. It is dangerous because it tells us that humanity and nature are separate. This prevents us from seeing how power and capital and domination have real histories that have been and are driving planetary life to the present state shift. This book is not a challenge to the Anthropocene in a strict sense. This strict sense is the geological Anthropocene. This is the terrain of geologists and earth system scientists, and their recent recommendation of stratigraphic markers for identifying the Anthropocene. Chicken bones, plastics, nuclear testing. These are the residues, the achievements of capitalist civilization that will be visible to geologists millions of years from now. This book is a challenge to the popular Anthropocene. And the popular Anthropocene poses several daunting questions. What is the character of 21st century ecological crisis? When and where did that crisis originate? What forces drive that crisis? That conversation, except for a brief moment in the 1970s, was marginal until the coming of the popular Anthropocene. So while it is a way of avoiding naming the system and a way of engaging the question of capitalism, it also poses powerful and important questions that we as radicals need to deal with. The popular Anthropocene has worked not only because it can be used to make many arguments, but also because it fits very comfortably with a view of population, environment, and history governed by food and resource use, and abstracted from class, from empire, from capitalism, from systems of racialized and gendered domination. If that sounds neo-Malthusian, it is. Not for its emphasis on population, but for ignoring what Marx calls capitalism's special laws of population, special laws, historical laws of population for human beings, but also for non-human life as well. We can think of the 60 billion animals, non-human animals, slaughtered in the meat industrial complex every year as one instance of that. But in Anthropocenic thought, history is the first casualty. Like Malthus in the 18th century, its major exponents substitute an abstract time for history and evacuate the very historical perspectives that is necessary to explain those famous hockey stick charts. If you imagine the CO2 and other charts that go like this and then spike up, the Anthropocene can identify those charts, can identify what's going on. It cannot explain the how and the where and the relations of power and domination and capital that are behind this. So the Capitalocene is precisely not an argument about geological history, although that's part of the argument. But for starters, the age of capital necessarily precedes and precipitates the geological signals necessary to discern a new geological era. So that era, the Anthropocene, will certainly outlast capitalism by a great many millennia, indeed thousands of millennia. The biospheric conditions of the ongoing planetary state shift, which is a really dry and euphemistic word for what the Earth system scientists then describe as irreversible and abrupt changes in the conditions of life on planet Earth, these will shape the conditions of human organization of whatever mode of production, whatever kind of civilization historical system comes next. The Capitalocene is an argument about thinking ecological crisis. It is a conversation about geohistory, though, rather than geological history, although, of course, the two are related. The Capitalocene challenges the popular Anthropocene's two-century model of modernity, a model premised on the Anglo-centric and racist and sort of colonial blind history of the Industrial Revolution, a techno and resource determinist model of the modern world that, in fact, leaves us ill-equipped to understand how capitalism has been so dynamic by constructing systems of racial and gender and class inequality that have cheapened the work and the lives of humans and the rest of nature for 5 centuries. So the origins of modern ecological crisis, and therefore of capitalism, cannot be reduced to England, to the 19th century, to coal, or to the steam engine. The Anthropocene's historical myopia, moreover, seems to be imminent to an intellectual culture. In this respect, the Capitalocene challenges not just the Earth system scientists, but many in the humanities and social scientists who embrace the Anthropocene as a means of refusing to name the system. So in this sense, the popular Anthropocene is but the latest of a long series of environmental concepts whose function is to deny the multi-species violence and inequality of capitalism and to assert that the problems created by capital are the responsibility of all humans. This is an old capitalist trick. We fucked it up. Now it's your responsibility to fix it. So, the politics of the Anthropocene, though, are even worse because they are an anti-politics in the sense of James Ferguson, the great critic of development. It is resolutely committed to the erasure of capitalism and to the promotion of a technocentric, technocratic vista of geomanagerialism and the erasure of popular politics. And if you look at the writings of Earth system scientists, they are dismissive of the possibilities for democratic and popular change to deal with the problems of climate change. And of course, climate change is simply one of a series of terrifying shifts in the world today. So the Anthropocene poses the question of nature-society dualism, but can't resolve it. It thinks 21st century problems with 16th century ideas. And a new synthesis would be premised on rethinking capitalism and work and life and power in the web of life, not related to an abstract nature out there, but always already co-produced in the web of life. And so it's now commonplace to invoke, and quite properly, system change, not climate change. Indeed. But we have to take care with how we think that system, part of system change. A critique of capitalism that accepts its self-definition as a market or a social system abstracted from the web of life will not guide us towards liberation, will not guide us towards sustainability. We should therefore be wary of views of capitalism reduced to their economic and social moments, the practice of what Donna Haraway calls human exemptionalism. Because exemptionalisms and exceptionalisms are always dangerous, especially when it comes to thinking about humanity with the uppercase H. That's a real abstraction, a real cultural force in our world that is deeply and intimately and powerfully involved in colonial structures of racial and gendered violence. The world ecology conversation argues the opposite, that capitalism develops through the web of life, and this means confronting the real abstractions of nature with a capital N, society with a capital S. And if we look at the history of the modern world from the 16th century, it was not only peasants who were pushed off the land, who were expelled from their homes and their communities. It was the majority of human beings under capitalist rule who were expelled from membership in society, in humanity. The better that indigenous peoples, women, peoples of color could be treated as part of nature and be treated cheaply. So underlying all of this is, well, how do we come to grips with the social specificity of capitalism? And what I say is that separating nature and society in the way that even radicals have come to do it is a very blunt and crude and ineffective instrument to understand the specific sociality, the specific social relations of humans in making power in structures of justice, of domination and injustice and all the rest. That human power is always a co-produced reality, and that power over other people is always made possible through power over land, over life, over extra-human life at every turn. There is no neat and tidy separation. Even that is the fantasy of bourgeois thought, that there is a neat and tidy separation. And so we need to deal with the question of labor in a doubly layered sense in terms of the real abstractions of nature and society and their closely linked binary, cognate binaries of race and gender and sexuality and other forms of domination, and as the web of life that is in us and through us and that we are in and through it. So the Capitalocene argument in the wider world ecology conversation, not a line, not a perspective, but a conversation, is prepared to go further than this, because it points beyond both the story of capitalism as a mechanism of domination and violence, and it points beyond a story of capitalism as a terrific apparatus of degrading nature. Both of those are, of course, true, but partial. It considers these moments, the violence, the exterminism of capitalism, as part of a central world historical process of environment making. It points towards a simple proposition: no politics of work without nature, no politics of nature without work. For the Capitalocene is a process of putting nature to work for free or low cost. This is the essence of the argument that capitalism is not a social system, but a way of organizing nature. It is a system of cheap nature. And it cheapens life in a double sense, not only in the sense of putting humans and the rest of nature to work for free or low cost, of reducing the socially necessary labor time, of accumulating capital on that basis, but also in a powerful ethico-political sense, in a Gramscian sense, to cheapen as in to degrade, to treat with less respect, to cheapen the lives and work of those humans historically assigned to the realm of nature: women, peoples of color, indigenous peoples. Now, how do we wrap this up? Well, many of us in this room are probably familiar with this famous statement that comes up very often from Marx: labor is not the source of all wealth. Nature is just as much the source of use values, he says. But strangely enough, the last part of the sentence is often removed. We forget this. What does he say? He says, labor itself is only the manifestation of a force of nature, human labor power. This wasn't a one-off. Marx says this again and again and again throughout the Grundrisse and Capital and other texts. So Marxist and environmentalist thought in their cognate political projects have so often failed to find common ground because they have ascribed what Marx calls, in the Critique of the Gotha program, supernatural powers to one or the other side of the nature-society binary. This is wilderness fundamentalism, preservation, protectionism. That's the sacred object for environmentalist thought, and it's work and labor justice, social justice on the other side for radical movements. So politically, of course, this leaves us where we see the contradictions playing out, both in hopeful and discouraging ways today around the conflict of the North Dakota Access Pipeline. We end up back with the Trumka-led AFL-CIO saying, jobs versus environment, we're always going to choose jobs. Now, whether or not red and green movements can find enough common ground in a short enough amount of time to avert the worst of global warming is uncertain. The stagnation of labor productivity growth in capitalism since the 1970s will probably intensify the jobs environment conflict, even if it reveals the practical bankruptcy of the capitalist growth model. And reading Marx, of course, alas, will not magically resolve the conflict, if only. But a radically ecologized and feminized reading of capitalism's history of both exploitation of wage workers and the appropriation of the unpaid work of, in Maria Mies's phrase, women, nature, and colonies, this offers a way to begin a conversation, to begin a thinking process, a collective thinking process through which work can begin to occupy a different thinking in both green and red thought. That is, we can look at this tripartite organization of work under capitalism, of paid work, wage work, unpaid human work, and the unpaid work of extra-human natures, without, however, collapsing the distinctiveness of any of these. So in this light, Marx may offer a way to cut through the mystifications of the labor-nature dichotomy. A dichotomy real enough in terms of how capitalism works, how capital sees the world, but violently destructive of any socialist project aiming to emancipate not some, but all life. So reimagining work in capitalism beyond labor fundamentalism provides a way forward, I think, in today's unpleasant and often terrifying reality. A revolutionary vision must be able to articulate a politics that links the crisis of the biosphere and the crisis of productive and reproductive work. A revolutionary politics of labor that cannot speak to the questions of precarious and dangerous work, of surplus humanity, of racialized, gendered, and sexualized violence will be doomed to failure. A revolutionary labor politics unable to speak to the ongoing crisis of planetary life and the ongoing state shift will be equally doomed. So the time has come for a conversation about how to forge a radical vision that takes as its premise the organic whole of life and biosphere, production and reproduction, and which takes as its goal the emancipation not of some life, but of all life. Thank you.
Right on. I'm not going to stand up. So I'm just going to speak about my chapter in this book. That was great, Jason. Jason is, I think, one of the most important and innovative thinkers of my generation, and is really doing a lot to enliven and renovate Marxism. So the chapter in this book that I wrote is about the state. And what I argue in this chapter is that the state is an environment-making institution. This is very much beholden to Jason's work. And part of the argument at a sort of a basic political level is to say, look, this new role that government has to take on if we are to confront the climate crisis and the ecological crisis in general, be that in the form of reform politics or in the form of socialism. I mean, what would socialism look like? It would look like a very robust state. And even interim reforms have to involve a renovation of the state and its reimposition of power over capital on the economy. So part of what my argument is that this is actually not a new role, that this is actually inherent to what the capitalist state does, for better and for worse. And that the question is not to get the state to be an environment-making institution, but to recognize that it is and to change the nature of its environment-making. So how is the state an environment-making institution? Well, I begin by entering into the question of value theory, right? And taking up where Jason mentioned about Marx's quote in the Gotha program about how labor is not the only source of wealth. Nature is just as much a source of use values as labor, and is surely use values that constitute economic wealth. Okay, so nature is a source of value just like labor. Well, where is nature, right? On the surface of the earth, in the form of trees, animals, waterfalls. He has a famous passage about the power of waterfalls, kind of the rents captured from from waterfalls, sort of locational advantage, which Jason fits into Jason's notions of sort of like the four cheaps, which are central to his book Capitalism and the Web of Life. So nature is on the surface of the earth. Well, what is it that delivers quote unquote nature? Because I'm very much in line with this effort to abolish the nature society distinction, but for the moment, like, let's just say, so where are the use values, the utilities, the useful qualities of biophysical reality? They're on the surface of the earth. What institutions in the modern era control the surface of the earth? States, right? States not only have geography, they are geography, right? They're fundamentally defined by the bounding of territory. State power happens geographically. Political power doesn't necessarily, right? There's empires that take the form historically of networks, etc. But the modern state is very much a geographically bounded entity. So then the question is looking at, well, how does the state, through its ultimate control of territory, through violence, crystallized as legal regimes, how does it deliver these use values to production, like the strength of wood that capital needs as a use value to process through production to turn into a table which is sold for exchange values, for the social power that is money, that can be anything, right? How does capital get that? How does one capitalist get those trees and not another capitalist? Through property regimes which are enforced by states. Some people have the right to these trees and cut them down and process, and others don't. And the ultimate arbiter of that in a situation that's not a failed state and an outlaw situation is government, is the state. So that's the basic entry point to realize, like, wait a minute, okay, so the state, because it is geographic, is also inherently environmental, and all of its policies, in that they relate to how social relations unfold across space, are inherently environmental. More specifically, states, if you get into their specific histories, are all about actually transforming landscapes so as to facilitate and conjure forth the forces of capitalism. And so the rest of the essay is a description of how capitalism was born in America, essentially, how it was midwifed, or how it was banged out politically with violence and law by the state. And in particular by Alexander Hamilton, who is the sort of the mastermind of the hidden developmentalist state in America. And he writes this report in 1791, the Report on Manufactures, which no one reads even now in the Hamiltonian moment, and no one reads it because I can't stand musicals, but whatever. Maybe it's in there, but from what I've heard, it's not in there. Why does no one read it? Because they love Hamilton when he's talking about finance and banks, but because it opens with an attack on Adam Smith. It opens with a repudiation of laissez-faire economics, and then proceeds to articulate a post-colonial defensive strategy. And Hamilton's vision is fundamentally, it's militaristic and nationalist. He's like, we will be dominated economically and then militarily if we do not develop a wealthy economy that funds a military force that can stand up to the core, right? We're the periphery, Britain is the core, they're coming to get us again. And we must have the wealth to fight them. And the only way we can do that is through developing manufacturing and manufacturers, as he said, right? Industrialization, they didn't use that word. And they didn't use the word capitalism. And he says, Adam Smith, he doesn't name Adam Smith, it's just like, this theory, he name checks it, he quotes Adam Smith, is like, this is not going to work, it's not true. Manufacturing doesn't just happen on its own. It has to be driven, it has to be nurtured by the state. And then he lays out this whole agenda of what he calls the means proper, about how the state should do this. And this is, in fact, how capitalism has developed everywhere that it has developed. And that text is really the first comprehensive description of these means. So how does the state do that? This agenda is also highly contested up to this day, as we can see. So the the first way the American government does this is through its use of land. It uses its control over territory as collateral to borrow against internationally and to distribute as subsidy to nascent firms, nascent sort of class formations that emerge and develop into capitalist forces of production. And the example I use mostly in this essay is the Erie Canal, because long story short, sort of the Hamiltonian vision is defeated and sort of progresses at the state level. So how was the Erie Canal built? It was built by large gifts of federal land and water to the state of New York, and then the state of New York would then use these, and this establishes a pattern for development of railroads and also a whole kind of pattern for public contracting that we still use today in many ways, whereby the state parceled out in alternate plots to private interests land that these contractors could then borrow against themselves and sell, raise money to then dig the canal. The canal is built essentially with this massive subsidies of cheap nature, right? Delivered not by just something or gathered up, delivered by the state and its violent legal control over territory. That then transforms New York, and it helps open what was called the Old Northwest, and really starts launching the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So that's the historical story, and part of the subtext and punchline in this essay was all about how to deal with climate change. And the argument is essentially that we have to acknowledge that the state is this environment-making institution, that it's doing the very same thing with fossil fuels, right? I mean, the fossil fuel industry is massively subsidized. And so the choice is not should the state essentially direct the economy or not? The choice is, how will the state direct the economy? Will it direct it over the cliff by continuing to subsidize fossil fuels? Or will it rescind those subsidies and subsidize a clean technology revolution, a clean energy revolution? And in that regard, this election is pretty, in some ways depressing, but in other ways, I don't know. It's actually, there's some openings, but it's going to be a terrible 4 years, no doubt. But the argument around that is, and now I think I'm sort of leading the terrain of the essay into just larger thoughts that relate to these questions, is that if the capitalist state, globally, in America, wherever, were to use its power to euthanize the fossil fuel industry and drive a clean technology revolution, which it could do, that would not be the same as creating a sustainable society. It would merely be to, at the last minute, avoid the edge of the cliff and buy time to deal with the more fundamental question, which is, the unsustainable nature of an economic system that has to grow infinitely on a planet that is finite. So that's the essence of the argument, which is that, if value is partially produced by biophysical reality other than human labor power, where is that? It's on the surface of the earth. What does that mean in the modern era? It means that the state is the key arbiter. It is the broker. It is the umpire in terms of who gets access to nature or biophysical reality, the web of life. And this goes on whether we acknowledge it or not. And part of the political choice we have to make is to see this, and we have to incorporate into our arguments the fact that this is not a proposal. This is a fait accompli. This already happens. This is how the thing works. And the question is not should the state, but how should the state do this? So I don't want to talk too long because there's a lot of people here, and I'm sure there's a lot of interesting questions. So those are my thoughts on this.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to pose a couple of questions and encourage Jason and Christian to kind of dialogue or discuss amongst themselves a little bit some further thoughts and amplifications, and then in about 15, 20 minutes we'll turn it over for your questions and comments. But first I wonder if Jason could just maybe very quickly run down the rest of the book and the other contributors and how the whole thing kind of comes together or fits. Let's not miss anybody.
The book is an ongoing conversation. Is eclectic. We have a wonderful kind of spoken word essay by Donna Haraway, a great feminist theorist, who talks. Are we okay there? All right. Sorry about that. There. Who talks about this Anthropocene, Capitalocene, and then her utopistics. And then her Socialist, which is her utopistics for thinking about a world beyond capitalism, one premised on interconnectedness and tentacular, as in an octopus, tentacular thinking. Eileen Christ runs through the problems of the Anthropocene thinking, its resolute commitment to a unified human enterprise, as I like to say, could a more neoliberal turn of phrase be found? Elmar Altvater asks us to think about the geomanagerial and technocratic bias, the anti-political bias, really, of Anthropocene thinking and what it means that so many of their recommendations fall back on technical fixes bereft of any social transformation, geoengineering being only the most conspicuous. Justin McBrien has a fantastic essay where he points out quite correctly that the Capitalocene is also a necrocene, an age of death, and that becomes increasingly activated in the course of capitalist development, especially after 1945, that capitalism not only brings an era of mass extinction, as we know, we are living through the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth, but also implicitly, and this is my own riff, suggests that extinction is too polite a term, that we should be talking about capitalism as a system of mass extermination and especially of intergenerational mass murder. And so those are some of the big themes that come up. And did I leave anyone out? And Dan Hartley, who writes a brilliant essay asking us to think about culture and cultural fixes and the role of culture in capitalism and in capitalism as environment-making process. And that's hugely important because not just in Anthropocene thinking, but also on the left in terms of political economy thinking about environmentalism, about environmental change rather, there is a profound and I think unfortunate vulgar materialism in play that we have to take seriously. Raymond Williams' arguments of ideas of nature and that we've mixed our labor with the earth so much that we cannot draw back and separate the two out, that is a material and symbolic process at once. And if we think about that, that's fundamental to Marxist thinking about political economy and the separation of conception and execution in the labor process, but somehow that's been dropped from thinking about global environmental change. So we have to be wary of a vulgar materialism, which I fear often comes in through the back door.
So Jason and Christian, one notion that's come up a couple of times tonight is cheap nature and the four cheaps. What are the four cheaps, and how does the state contribute to keeping them cheap or rise to the challenge of keeping them cheap? Well, and why is it important that they be cheap?
Let me try an alley-oop here. So four cheaps, the idea of capitalism as a system of cheap nature is essentially that every great wave of economic expansion and world accumulation must reset the cost of production for labor, food, energy, and raw materials, the four cheaps. And that means to increase the volume of those, simultaneously reducing the price of those. So agricultural revolutions are a key example of that. More and more food produced with less and less labor power. That's central. So in that process, however, capital is rather powerless in terms of its capacity to reset the costs of production. It requires the state.
Yeah, it is indistinguishable from the state, right? It is a state project in many ways, right? I mean, capital as a force of turning use values into exchange values emerges outside of the state within empires. I mean, you know, that kind of the cash nexus exists before capitalism, but it comes to dominate through the project of the emergence of the modern capitalist state. But in terms of the question of the four cheaps, I think this is a very important idea and very good, but maybe because I'm some sort of I feel an obligation to sort of be a compulsive optimist because I'm ultimately very pessimistic. So there is this one cheap that I think I differ with Jason on, and it is the question of energy, because the four cheaps are, which you didn't name actually, right, which are cheap labor, cheap raw materials, cheap energy, and
Food.
cheap food, right?
Yeah.
So energy is actually potentially infinite, right? This came to me reading Bataille's great book, The Accursed Share, Volume 1. I mean, Bataille is owned by the wrong side. All these cultural, sort of navel-gazing, obscurantists love Bataille. But if you actually read The Accursed Share, it's, one, very Marxist, borderline Stalinist, I would say, on this chapter on the Soviet Union. And there's a kind of, beautiful materialism, and he opens with the discussion of the power of the sun. And you realize, this is like every day more energy hits the planet's surface than all of human civilization has used, right? So there's one cheap out there which is potentially infinite. And you could imagine, this is pitched at a very abstract level, you could imagine how the other cheaps, if their energy content grows and that energy is supplied by solar energy, could become cheaper, right? So you and others have written about the sort of the horizontal frontiers, the Americas, right? That's the original frontier that launches the development of capitalism. And then the vertical frontiers going into the ground for fossil fuels. But the vertical frontier might not be done, right? There's the other one going up or receiving what's coming down. That would only happen, obviously, if the state directed policy in that way, and the fundamental thing would have to be to confront the vested interests of the fossil fuel industry and use legal power to put them out of our misery. There is, I think, reason to, at the abstract level, not sort of politically, but just at the abstract level, to be hopeful, which is that even this society has the technology, it has the money, it even has the laws on the books to do this. And there is also actually this other frontier for capitalism, which is the infinite energy coming down from the sun. The problem is it is politically incapable of doing that, partly because the leading section of the leading ruling class globally, the American ruling class, is, as Doug Henwood says, a rotten social formation. And it's a rotten social formation because of its victories. It has won, it beat the left internationally, it beat the left domestically, and at that point, it fell apart because the ruling class is like any other class, right? Marx says the working class is a class in itself just because of its relationship to the means of production, but how does it become a class for itself? Through class struggle, right? Well, so too for the ruling class, right? They're a class in themselves because they own the means of production. Well, how do they become a class for themselves? How do they develop ruling class consciousness? How do they organize? How do they develop? How do they push their agenda? By being threatened, right? By having rebellions. And those are sometimes rebellions of nature. Disease has been a very important force in forming kind of rational factions within the ruling class that then plan. But mostly it's been political. It's been rebellions and it's been external enemies. And so victory has essentially let the herd develop mange and go to seed, and the wolves are gone. I mean, in that regard, the kind of the finance guys and the right-wingers are right, but they have the agents wrong. It's like it's the left, it's the grassroots, it's the people who play the role of the wolves vis-a-vis the ruling class and keep that herd together. And once they're gone, the herd goes to seed. And so now you have Donald Trump. Now you have policies that don't serve the interests of capitalism in general. We don't have a healthcare policy that helps reproduce capitalism. We have a healthcare policy that serves the interests of the healthcare industry. We don't have an energy policy that will reproduce capital accumulation again and again on a global scale. We have an energy policy that serves the immediate interests of one industrial faction, the fossil fuel industry. And there's no coordinating authority within the class that seems capable of taking the state to steer us away from the cliff. Instead, we have one of these renegade factions, the fossil fuel faction, has dominated the GOP and has now got 3 branches of the government, and things look bad.
So it sounds as though our national state in the U.S. at least is turning into, and not only in the U.S., but is turning away from being an environment-making state to an environment-destroying state. Would you go that far?
No, I mean, if we're to use, if we're to use, Jason's, if we're to follow Jason's urging of stepping away, taking this as a serious political project, that there are problems associated with continually dividing reality into society and nature, right? We can't do that. So no, it's always environment making, right? If Jim Hansen is correct and the Venus syndrome unfolds, that will be the product of human environment making. Yeah, I mean, and if you read environmental history, there is no moment where there isn't human environment making. Many of you, I'm sure, have read this sort of stuff, but for those who haven't, only in the last 20 years are we getting clear about the role of fire and human beings' use of fire to create whole landscapes. Here in the Northeast, Native Americans, all this romantic racism about they treaded lightly on land, that's all bullshit, right? They would burn the landscape twice a year. They turned the place into a game park by literally burning everything, So it wasn't like nature, the untouched preserve. It was produced by societies and through human society interaction. And part of what Jason's argument is that biophysical reality is just a series of organism-environment interactions, right? Every organism interacts with its environment, and every organism is part of the environment of some other organism. And all organisms are environment makers to some extent, and we just happen to be the most extreme and robust of those. Beavers need beaver dams. They don't find them, they make them. This goes on and on and on.
That's right. And hominin evolution itself is premised on fire. That as hominins learned to use fire to cook food, digestive systems got smaller, increased, and so there's continually this introversion, extroversion of the question of nature within human species evolution, if you will. And this is the argument of people like Richard Levinson, Richard Lewontin, who emphatically and correctly, in my view, point out that historical change of all life is always a co-productive dynamic, and that humans make environments, environments make us, and the same is true for all life.
Okay, final question before we turn it over, and Jason began to address this, and I think Christian probably did too, but when I read Capitalism and the Web of Life, I don't see a great deal of kind of classic Marxist class struggle. Mm-hmm. And you alluded to the position of the U.S. labor movement or the official AFL-CIO on the Dakota Access Pipeline. So how do struggles of labor at the point of production or in the value-producing sphere of classic capitalism interact with and hopefully reinforce or potentially reinforce struggles that take place in this broader sphere of appropriation, where people in Latin America, in North Dakota, are resisting the efforts of capital to produce for itself more cheap nature at their expense?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the great challenge of radical thought for perhaps the past 30 years is how to integrate the question of class struggle, the question of capital accumulation, and the question of nature. So class struggle I would use in that formulation in a more expansive way to include a variety of forms of contestation and conflict that include indigeneity and questions of race and gender and sexuality and so on and so forth. I think the difficulty in answering the question, and this is why it's not in the book as much as I would like to see it, is that we don't have a scholarship that seeks to link up precisely the processes of class struggle in that broad sense that you identify. We don't have a history of the post-World War II expansion that takes the class struggles and class compacts within organized labor with the struggles around race and gender. Those are treated historiographically as discrete movements, even if empirically their relations are sometimes grasped between the student movement and the African American freedom struggle or feminism. We don't have a sense of how labor politics and politics of justice around social reproduction and questions of boundary struggles, to use Nancy Fraser's wonderful phrase, around who gets to be a member of society. This is the question of the African American and feminist movements and other movements as well. So to begin a conversation about that is of the utmost importance, because we have to have a conversation and analytics and research around how struggles link up across these domains, as you just pointed out, of peasant struggles, of indigenous struggles, of working class struggles in places like Shenzhen. How do we begin to conceive of their interrelatedness? Even to pose the question is to point out the glaring lacunae within radical scholarship. And that radical scholarship has been in part a victim of its own success. It's of establishing certain domains of research in race, class, and gender, indigeneity, labor struggles that have not spoken to each other anywhere near as much as they need to. And there's also the question of how do they hook up with the questions of capital accumulation. So the best answers that I can give you are always episodic, that we see during periods of profound crisis, and you saw this in the late 60s and early 1970s. You had simultaneously a revolt around questions of social reproduction, around the point of production, and then around the question of decolonization and national liberation. How do we begin to integrate those within an understanding of capitalism's mode of organizing nature? That's the kind of question that we can start to unpack in through the world ecology conversation.
I think that your question hinted at some answers there. You talk about appropriation, production, class struggle, right? Okay, well, I mean, what is appropriation? Grabbing use values from biophysical realities. Well, what does that? Like forms of production, right? I mean, the Dakota Access Pipeline is a perfect example. And I like the way you put that, making more cheap nature, right? Production is the way appropriation happens. I mean, you don't appropriate cheap nature without producing access to it. So then the next question is, well, what's class struggle? Is it just workers in a workplace, or is class struggle the struggle against capital? And if you read class struggle as the struggle against capital, then the Dakota Access Pipeline struggle, regardless of what anyone there thinks, is class struggle, right? It is people resisting the production/appropriation of cheap nature in the interest of capital accumulation. And they're doing that by putting their bodies on the line, by publicity, by suing, et cetera, et cetera. And what's the kind of like physical mechanism is the price point, right? It's like driving up the cost of this production slash appropriation. If Obama were to agree to move the pipeline for a third time, supposedly that would put the whole project beyond profitability. So I think that is the nexus, essentially, which is that it's like to see appropriation as dependent on production and to not get locked into some sort of silly kind of cartoon version of what class struggle is, which much of the cultural left would have you believe that class struggle is when guys in blue overalls put down their wrenches. No, class struggle is when people oppose the agenda of capital.
Thank you. So one way to do that is on November 15th, next Tuesday, 4 p.m. at Foley Square, 111 Worth Street, Stand with Standing Rock demonstration and protest at the Army Corps of Engineers. Another way to relate to that would be to join our study group starting February 8th on ecological imperialism, settler colonialism, and indigenous resistance. There are flyers at the desk. And then the last announcement would be the weekend of December 3rd, 4th, and 5th. Current prospects for a socialist movement in the United States on Saturday evening the 3rd. Book fair here on Sunday the 4th, noon to 6 p.m. And on Monday the 5th, organizing in the era of the gig economy with Peter Rugg. And again, there are flyers at the desk. There are also books on sale, and I'm sure our authors would be happy to autograph them for you. So I think Michael is going to
I'm going to
facilitate this with the mic. So speak into the mic as you pose your question so it can be captured for the folks watching online.
So who has a question?
Michael?
Oh, wait, Melissa, and then,
I'm sorry, I have to go first because I have to go home. But I first want to say that the Web of Life book by Jason Moore is, I run this place. And I have had many, many events here over the last 6 years. And many people have offered books and all kinds of things. But to my mind, Jason Moore's book is probably the most important book that has come out in the last 10 years. And that's just my personal opinion, but it's an extremely important book. And it's hard to digest if you are not familiar with that history, the historical, the history in which it's grounded. He tells me that they're going to come up with a new version that will help make it more accessible to more people, but it's extremely important to me. And that's one, and I could say that there was one book that I could name that explains why I set up the Commons, that's it. Because I'm trying to link Marxism with permaculture and people who understand that we are not separate from nature, that we are part of nature. And that was one book that finally hit me from the Marxist tradition. So I just really can't recommend it enough. I'm hoping that some people become more accessible soon. But
We're working on it.
but,
That inaccessible. Don't be intimidated.
but on the question of the state, Christian, you said that you made a phrase that of course the socialist state would be more robust. I don't think there's an of course there. And I would wonder, it would be splendid, I think, if someone would take the tradition of Jim Scott, who has written Seeing Like a State, and how states try to make life more legible, and nature more legible, and destroying nature in order to make it more legible to the state. This whole tradition of Jim Scott, and that is an anarchist tradition, and joining it with Jason Moore's admonition to let us not separate ourselves from nature. Those two things joined to me would be like, oh, bingo, that's it. But this notion, I would like you to tell me why I should automatically agree with you, like, oh, of course, the state will be more robust under socialism.
Well, it would have to be. It seems that you're attaching a sort of normative quality to robust. Like robust is good. I'm using it in a technical sense. It would be bigger. I mean, what is socialism? Okay, maybe. I mean, you're describing an anarchist reality. I don't. That's not what I was describing. I was describing kind of like a standard view of socialism, and a modern society with authority. All that ugly stuff we want to deny, but even the worst socialist states are robust in that they get up in your face, and in the James Scott sense are like all over the place. What I'm talking about robust is capacity to do, to execute. Now that might be horrible stuff, or it might be very progressive. But the point is, I reject a version of socialism which is like, oh, there's a momentary dictatorship of the proletariat, and then the state just dissolves away. It's like, no, I don't buy that. I really don't buy that. I don't think you have an urbanized society, the level of enemy. You wipe out private property relations, and then human beings are just nice to each other. That is a position that is ignorant of human history. That is like, we have dangerous capacities as groups, as individuals, to think that a socialist future, which right now seems very, very impossible and far away, would automatically be harmonious, as I think ridiculous. So I think there would be laws, there would be states, there would be violence implicit in that, and there would be technological organization and management. And the question would be, would it be good or would it be bad?
Well, exactly, and Melissa, thank you very much for those kind words. It's a real honor. I think also that we have this issue. One of the things I find so inspiring about Christian's arguments is that he is prepared to go into this messy, sometimes ugly space of actually existing politics to think about what are we going to do about the climate emergency without resorting to an emergency politics. I think that's a real danger of saying catastrophe, is that ultimately it can be a preparation for an authoritarian state solution. And on the other side, on the left, you have figures like Bellamy Foster, who have no real political program. They have a revolution or die. And that might sound good at a rally, but we need to get into the messy politics. We need to, on the left, occupy the messy, difficult space of asserting a socialist politics around state power, because the states, as you pointed out, are the only institutions big enough to deal with climate change.
Christian, my name is Jenny Brown. I'm with National Women's Liberation. Getting into the messy space of actual politics, when you talked about the election, you said you saw some openings. And I wonder if you elaborate on that.
Well, the opening I see, is just that the Democratic Party of the DLC tradition is totally corrupt and rotten to the core, and it's good that it has been smashed open. I'm not going to say it's over, right? I'm not going to make the mistake of people in 2008 with the financial crash are like, this is the end of neoliberalism. It's like, no, it wasn't. And this is not the end of the DLC. They're like right on it, right? They're like, it's the fault of the white working class. All these people are racist. And that needs to be pushed back against. These people are, not to put too fine a point on it, total fuck-ups and incompetence in their own terms. I had the dubious honor last night of being on a panel with someone from the Center for American Progress, who was one of their kind of defense hawk types. And it was like incredible how bland and banal and empty most of what she said was. It was not, the conversation was not like clashing, it was like trying to figure out what she was saying. Because her comments were stuff like, militaries are made for fighting wars, the country's going through lots of changes. Like, this is the level that these people actually think at, right? As witnessed by the fact we saw this thing, like Hillary Clinton outspent Trump 4-1, and like how she lost areas that Obama had won by 20 points. Like she basically lost Youngstown. He won that by 20 points in 2012. She lost, these are the white working class areas that are guilty of racism, but they voted for a black president twice. Bernie beat her by 18 points in Wisconsin. She didn't go there to campaign, and she lost it. On and on and on. 500,000 black women didn't vote. There's like, 1.5 million white men seem to have like not voted for the Democratic Party. It's not just that there's this surge of people for the Republican Party, right? The whole voter turnout is down, and for the Democrats it's down, because it's like, what was there to vote for? These people had more money than God, they had every computer you could want, and they completely lost it in their own terms. The pundit class, this is incredible. This is incredible. And they need to be punished, they need to be exposed, they need to be disciplined for this. So that's the only opening. In terms of the actual policy, the Trump administration is going to be horrible, right? But then on the other hand, part of me is thinking, this is horrible. They're going to try and get rid of the EPA. And on the other hand, I was like, what did Obama do? In the bigger picture, it doesn't matter if you sort of slightly slowed the rate of carbon loading of the atmosphere. It only matters if you avoid the worst tipping points. And the Obama administration basically inherited from the Bush administration a situation that should have forced them to act. And that was the results of Massachusetts versus EPA, which was a Supreme Court case that said the Environmental Protection Agency must regulate greenhouse gas emissions. That case took 10 years to get through the Supreme Court, and it said, now the government must regulate the greenhouse gas emissions. We have forced the amendment of this 1970 Act. The Obama administration dragged its heels, and finally towards the end, they issued one rule, which was, okay, there's these strict carbon limits, emissions limits for new coal-fired power plants. That wasn't going to happen. The fracking revolution alone had taken off these things off the board. So they did all that. And then people are like, he's going to open federal lands to the oil industry. It's like, Obama opened the Arctic. He opened the West Coast. He opened the East Coast. I mean, what are we, So Parenti was like, I don't know, like, there was a lot of backlash. There was a lot of heroic struggle around those infrastructure projects under the Obama era. But I think that if Trump comes out swinging on that front, we're going to see a level of resistance that we haven't before. Now, I don't want to fall into one of these kind of like after Hitler us type mistakes that the Communist Party in Germany made, right? But it's just that there's an opening, not that it's going to be good necessarily.
No, you have to speak loud.
Can you hear me okay now?
I don't think it's on.
Is it green?
Very
Shout it
maybe
then.
if I really shout
Yeah,
like this,
it's good now.
so I have a little bit of a cold, so this is an extra struggle for me. Thank you so much. I thought this was really fascinating. My name is Johnny. I'm a historian, a grad student in history of science at Yale. I have two questions, one about cheapness and one about nature. And in some way, the link is actually to get away from purely looking at the state, I guess, in the organization of these kinds of questions. So the first question about cheapness. There's a sense I get from this that if we just paid full cost, then things would be okay. If we pay wages for housework, if we have full cost accounting somehow in how we manage our economy, then stuff will be somehow accounted for in a positive sense. And I wondered if you could develop a little bit more. I assume you don't think this, right, to be clear. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the organization, say, of money or value in a sort of non-capitalist organization of nature, which seems to be a sort of crucial question, money being in some sense a sort of distributed question of debt, and how in fact debt relations between classes and nature and the state in some sense can be reconfigured. Second question about nature, I wonder where are the scientists in some of these questions? It seems the question of who speaks for nature and therefore what form nature takes is a fundamental question of knowledge and the organization of that knowledge. So I wondered if there's a fundamental role not just for politics but for epistemology in these kinds of future developments.
Well, yes, of course, a fundamental issue of epistemology, and that we need to decolonize our thinking about nature. We need a plurality of epistemologies, and we need to understand that humans are part of the web of life. That doesn't mean we do away with distinctions. Dialectics proceeds through distinctions with a view of what, Marx's system of thought is a philosophy of internal relations, to understand their fundamental conditions of unity through diversity and difference. So there's that. The wages for housework question. Well, wages for housework was on the one hand an absurd demand, on the other a revolutionary demand, because to call for capital to pay its own cost of reproduction is to call for an abolition of capitalism, because no one can make a profit under those conditions. So that's central. So no, clearly, there's an interesting way to take the argument. Well, if everything was paid on its own terms, everything would be okay. In a fundamentally different value system, then we would have a different valuation, not just a valuation in that double register that I talked about. A valuation that an alternative valuation would have not only a different way of understanding what's valuable and worthwhile, not socially necessary labor time, but would also have a fundamentally different ethico-political system of valuing, in my view, life and the politics of life and the politics of reproduction. Now, putting that in those general terms, of course, doesn't do a lot, but I think it allows for a different kind of conversation, because we're dealing with very deeply complex ontological, epistemological, and practical political issues. So, for a start, thanks.
Were you going to speak to that, Christian? Okay. All right.
The one thing I would say, if it's not clear, it's like, the point about the four cheaps is that, like, profit is the unpaid use values, right? That's like if labor were paid, given the full amount of exchange value produced, there would be no profit. And similarly, the four cheaps. So that's where profit comes from in Jason's formation of this. So the suggestion of like paying the proper price, it suggests a kind of a politics of sort of knob adjusting and this sort of like technocratic, socially responsible investment. And that as a political process, leaving aside the larger kind of fundamental problems of value, is just not going to work. There needs to be something more robust, I think.
Because the condition of some work being valued under capitalism is that most work is not. Most work is devalued.
Okay, Dinesh, you're up. Just speak directly into it. Talk loud. Speak directly into it. You have to hold it right into it.
If that's supposed to be connecting to speakers, it doesn't sound like it's connecting to speakers.
It's connected to the public webcast.
Okay, so we're not supposed to hear it. It's supposed to be recorded.
Yes, yes.
So just a couple of comments and then a question. I mean, the first place I want to thank Jason. It's a wonderful shifting of the paradigms, absolutely crucial and very central in the enterprise that you're constructing. And it's central also, like in the sense in which you are evoking a long durée attempt to conceptualize the ecological question. I think it's very novel and it's much appreciated. Having said that, I have a couple of questions. I mean, one is that like if you look at the ways in which our own current geopolitical conjuncture is being shaped, do we not see a shift in the center of capital accumulation towards the East Asian region? And if that is the case, and it is the case, since that is the case, how does one approach the question of the Capitalocene in the way in which you like to formulate it under these kinds of circumstances? I mean, what does it mean to think in terms of an ecological crisis on a global level, given that the center of capital accumulation has shifted towards the East Asian region in particular? I mean, I don't see any mention of that in in your address, so I was wondering if you had a response for that. That's one thing. The other is in response to an earlier question that was framed to you in terms of the relative absence of class struggles in your Web of Life, a book that unfortunately I've not read, but I'll most certainly read. So the absence of class struggles, I mean, like one thing comes to mind at once. I mean, like if you read, for instance, the work of Philip McMichael, he makes a very strong case all through for the ways in which poor women, for instance, have always been the custodians of nature. There are all kinds of poor people's movements, in short, that in a very crucial way, in crucial ways, seek to defend the intensification of ecological destruction. So why is this not important to conceptualize as well? I mean, why fetishize the state as if the state were the only means of protecting?
Well, I don't think anyone's fetishizing the state.
Sorry?
I don't think anyone is fetishizing the state.
I mean, I'm just like putting that over there.
Someone has to. It's so out of it.
Fine. So you go ahead and fetishize it if you like. I mean, but the point is that, I mean, the point also, like in the context of state-centered analysis, is to perhaps ponder the question. I mean, there's a question, for instance, that Giovanni Arrighi has raised, the question of the withering away of the interstate system, the tendential shift towards the withering away of the interstate system, like which in turn raises other kinds of questions, which may not be in the purview of your project. I mean, but these two questions, I mean, the question of class struggles, poor people's struggles to shape the environment in all kinds of places, I mean, especially in the South, in the global South, and this is an ongoing project. And second, the context of the emergence of East Asia as the most dynamic center of the global economy. And how does one conceptualize Capitalocene under these circumstances?
Well, gee, that's a great question. So the rise of China, how do we put that into play? Well, you can see that the rise of China, my colleague Alvin Kamba has done a great job looking at how the Chinese project from the late 70s all the way through to the early 2000s was indeed premised on a very explicit state strategy of resetting the four cheaps, of cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials. And that all those started to show definite signs of wear from 2003 on. And we're seeing this around the questions of the relative end, I'll underscore relative end of cheap labor in China for reasons of class struggle, but not only for reasons of class struggle. Of course, you're right about the role of movements of the environmentalism of the poor, to use Martinez Allier's phrase without endorsing his neo-Malthusianism. Yes, of course, environmental justice movements across the global south have been of central importance and are centrally important to finding, securing some means of livelihood and some measure of capacity to sustain life in many areas of the South. So yes, that's hugely important. And class struggle is in the book. It's just the book is written in the model of Harvey and Arrighi and, yes, Marx. It's an imminent critique of capital. So one, as Giovanni would always, I'm sure he told you as well as me, we can't do everything at once. Remember the long 20th century? Why didn't you talk about class struggle, Giovanni? Well, and he had a very long answer, and of course he took up those questions brilliantly elsewhere. And so we have to look at these conversations and books as part of an ongoing evolution of ideas. So in terms of how China is the last stand of the Capitalocene in the narrative that you give us, and that China has handled brilliantly the challenges of maintaining cheap natures in various ways, especially with food policy, but distinct from the Americans, the British, and the Dutch before then, has pioneered no agricultural revolution that not only promises to produce more food with less calories, indeed quite the opposite in the recent decade, but it has also failed to provide an agricultural model for the whole world. So that would be the beginning of a response to your wonderful and erudite question.
And, I think one has to ask the question about what do we mean by capital accumulation, right? Do we mean capital accumulation in the sense of building up capital stock? And what about the question of, the class project of seizing surplus? And if we misrecognize the deindustrialization of the United States, which is a collapse of a type of capital accumulation in the U.S. for profitability, that's wrong, right? The U.S. ruling class has restored profitability through accumulation by dispossession, through its capture through finance of surplus produced elsewhere. So I sensed in your question, I don't think you meant this, but possibly we're misrecognizing the class relations for the built environment. And it's like the core capitalist classes are doing very well. They are capturing more than their share of surplus produced globally. So I think that's part of the answer.
That's not what I was denying or arguing.
But I think so that's part. I think that's part of what the meaning of capital accumulation in East Asia is. It doesn't necessarily mean a decline of profit capture for Western ruling classes.
I did not say that.
Okay, I'm not saying you said it, but that was implied. And I mean, there's also the question of Africa in all this, right? I mean, what is China's solution to the limits of the Four Chiefs? The continent of Africa, right? There's an official.
China's relationship to Africa is not the same as the kind of relationship that Western Europe and the US.
Oh, of course not. Of course not. Yes, of course not. Because it's based on actual capital accumulation and actual capture. It's based on forms of production that. Yes, I agree with you. It's based on forms of production. Can I finish? It's based on forms of production that access the appropriation of cheap nature, unlike Western capitalists, which just through finance try to capture flows of surplus, right? But that is China's right now spatial fix, right? And there are officials on record who are saying, what do we do about the environmental crisis here? We export 1/3 of our industrial base and at least 100 million people. And then they had the whole going out strategy. This is an official strategy after 2005. It's like direct foreign investment from China into Latin America and Africa in response to, among other things, the environmental crisis in China.
Stand up. My name is Jan Gerard. I'm a citizen of the Netherlands with a resident of the US. My son brought me here. Said, Dad, this may be of interest, and it is in the sense that I've worked 40 years in water resource management in the world in 20 countries. for World Bank, Asian Development Bank, USAID, and the EU. And I could make you, based on the fact that I was team leader for the World Bank on the study of the Kilimanjaro mountain, today Ernest Hemingway's book, The Snow of the Kilimanjaros, would require a new title because there is no more snow. Climate change. I worked in Cambodia in 2015 for the Asian Development Bank in developing a loan on these issues of land, water, and so on, of two big systems built during the Pol Pot regime, built by 50,000 people digging these canals and then being shot when the canals were finished. Then Pol Pot disappeared into the forest. The Asian Development Bank, based on the request of the government of Cambodia, looked at how to revitalize or use these canals built. And one of the things I discovered in the first months there, was that much of the land along these canals were bought by Chinese companies and Korean companies already ended. Nobody knew. The Asian Development Bank didn't know either. The same in Tanzania, where I was in 2012 as team leader on the Kilimanjaro watershed, Pangani River. First of all, you don't get data, and what data you find out yourself by visiting the area is that British companies producing sugar under a parastatal agreement with the government own all the land and all the water, and there were 80,000 farmers who had no water and totally destructive land. And if you talk to park rangers, the animals are disappearing at a rate, which we now hear, of 60-70% is already gone. And if you see how the road between Moshi and Arusha is being developed, there's no more opportunity in the future for animals to cross from Kenya into Tanzania as the climate change required. Now, climate change is something that has three major elements. It's drought management, it's flood management, and it is using the time of the calendar of the year. In both countries, subject to climate change, the drought period is increasing. It's going from 3 months to 5 months. Being an irrigation expert, I have a PhD of Colorado State University, 1975. It tells me that I need to have more discipline among the farmers. So the farmers are used as a kind of cheap labor, and I feel very much for your line of thought that what we call in World Bank terms or institutional development is that the state forces the users of the land and the water to be cheap labor, to do what it instructs them to do and provides them with the tools. And then I could tell you long stories. When those loans are then finalized and this institutional development comes up, how do we train our own institutions? The Ministry of Water, in this case in Cambodia last year, said, well, the other ones should do that, we will do the technical work. So the Asian Development Bank provides funds for the Ministry of Water to build those canals and do as they want, and the other things are assumed. What you see happening in both areas is that the famous title of the book, Nature Without Us, nature takes it back. And the country with one of the most top deforestation, I've worked 16 years in Indonesia, 8 years in the Philippines, been in northern Afghanistan, Balak in 2004, now in Cambodia. Every day I drove from Phnom Penh up to the two areas on Tonle Sap Lake. I counted 40 trucks with logs this big, and that goes on and on and on. Why? Military have rights to cut trees because the irrigation areas couldn't be used. Why don't you cut trees? That gives you some income. So I, being 70 years old, I have the most white hair of all of you. Having seen the world, 20 countries, 40 years, visited 70 countries for land and water management. I am so pessimistic. Coming to the US to be with my son, and then you elect Donald Trump. So how do you think I feel? So thank you for listening. If you have some more, I'll talk to you later. But it is very dire out there. And many places where I worked in Indonesia, Sumatra, Java, has been deforested completely. Thank you.
Okay, yes. If you want to be further depressed, read my last book, Tropical Chaos: Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence.
But I think this is what I say in response to comments like yours, which is completely right on comment. The easy intellectual case to make is that it's all over, that human civilization, due to capitalism, has blown through the limits and created climate tipping points that will lead to the extinction of all life on Earth in the form of the Venus syndrome that Hansen lays out in his book, right? That's the easy case to make, and it's easy because that's probably what's going to happen in many ways. However, it is not inevitable, and there is actually a credible case to be made against it. And the more difficult and the more important intellectual work is to make a credible case as to how that's not going to happen. And I think that can be done. And it has to do with this kind of ruthless, pragmatic approach to what has to happen now, what has to happen in the future, realizing, what the real politics, real environmental politics would look like. And just to repeat what I said something earlier, right? This society, the United States, definitely has the money, and it definitely has the technology, and it actually has the laws right now. Trump might eliminate the EPA, but all of the components for an energy transition, which would not reconcile human civilization with the limits of the planet, but would buy time, all of that is in place, and that's usually not pointed out. And if we realize that, okay, wait a minute, this is genuinely, it's not just a nice, hopey, optimistic thing to say, it's a political process. It's like, no, it is, because there aren't financial, all the pieces we need are there, and if, people could recognize that, they would probably not be as pessimistic. So it's not that pessimism isn't rational, it's just that it's not.
I have one line on that. It depends, in my eyes, also very much on the multilateral institutions like World Bank, of what they are willing to finance. If they are not willing to finance the formation of the
states, right? I mean, look at how
China has, outlent the World Bank in Africa, right?
So I wanted to ask, you haven't mentioned, and I'm curious, what is the role of the transnational corporation? The corporation that essentially, I think, takes away a sense of a person's identity with a nation and makes it, in fact, an identity with a transnational capitalist entity. What is the role of that kind of group, through structural adjustment that tries to, in fact, eliminate government and is creating, it seems to me, a national or international governance that, in fact, tries to eliminate the state? What is the role in relation to the issues you've talked about?
Well, I don't know. I guess I see it a bit differently. I think that the transnational states are, by and large, supported, facilitated, the transnational corporations, rather, are facilitated by different imperial states. So I think that we're looking at a world that looks more like Lenin than Kautsky's vision of what's going on. That in fact we're seeing the intensification of rivalries and potential rivalries between the various states and the transnational corporations headquartered in them. Right?
And frequently even owned partly by these states. The oil industry is outside of the U.S. predominantly state-owned. Thomas Friedman is what he is, but he does have that great quote, which is like, when McDonald's needs support, it doesn't go to McDonnell Douglas, it goes to the U.S. government. He's got this whole list of it's like, right, like that. There isn't this escape in the moment of crisis. Corporations don't escape the state, right? When things are going well, they resist regulation, et cetera, but when there's a collapse, a crisis, as in 2008, they run back to the apron of the state, and the state bails them out, and the state subsidizes, and the state resets prices, buys low, sells back high. There's no escape from the state, despite the rhetoric of globalization and the end of the state. And that's part of what I'm pushing back against, is this naturalization of the decline of the state. I don't know how many times I've heard people be like, "Well, states." I mean, it's like people have no idea. They've never even looked into what the political economy and economic history of states are. And if you start doing that, you realize no, like there is no beyond the state for capital. And that gets back to the point about value and property regimes, right? It's like what determines property regimes? It's states, fundamentally. Mitch.
Let me get this to you, Mitch.
And how should we give these people? We're losing our audience here. I think people want to take time.
I think we're scheduled tomorrow.
Oh, okay. Right.
So what does all this mean for what we radicals will do?
Boy, I wish I had the answer to that.
You guys are talking on a level that's pretty brilliant, it's pretty interesting, it's way beyond me on a lot of it. I have no idea what it means, what the implications are. I know, that the genetic engineering that's going on, it requires the state. Clinton and Gore were big proponents of genetic engineering. Colonialism of the cell, not only in expanding outward, but expanding inward, finding a new type of production or new type of accumulation. I know that in terms of solar energy, Exxon's been buying up patents, every patent they could get on solar energy since the past 30 years. So what does it mean in terms of, again, what we should be doing that's different if we adopt your analysis, and what does it mean that we would be doing differently than what we're already doing?
Well, that's a great question, and my answer is not going to be very satisfying to you for this reason, because we are, and this is a word that's overused, and I don't like it, but I'm going to use it anyway. There is a paradigm shift going on that where we can now see that just like the forest and the farm are parts of environment, so is the factory, so is the office, so is the city in which we live. And once we begin to look at those connections, we start to link the politics of work and the politics of life and the politics of housing and the politics of, air quality and of water quality and of food justice and who gets food and what kinds of food. That we're now being able to ask questions and make political demands, for instance, around food justice, for instance, that are not resolvable through the old productivist solutions. GMOs are a great example of that. The net contribution of GMOs to agricultural productivity in the world has been zilch. In fact, the agricultural productivity growth has continued to falter. And that tells us the bankruptcy of the capitalist productivist project. And it's not just agricultural productivity, it's industrial labor productivity too. This is the point for Christ's sake, the neoclassical economist Robert Gordon has been making this argument very well lately, the ongoing stagnation in labor productivity growth. Remember in the 70s, we were promised robot factories. What did we get? The global sweatshop. All right, so on the other side, we have food justice, food sovereignty movements, which for all their problems, and there are lots of problems, say that food as nutrition, food as democracy, food as right to cultural determination are unthinkable except in relation to each other. That's a new kind of demand, and we're seeing that proliferate. I think the best elements of climate justice do this as well. They say not only is the problem the carbon coming out of the smokestacks and the cars, but also Wall Street. That if we want to understand that industrialization is giving us CO2 emissions, we also have to understand Wall Street as a way of organizing nature, of derivatives and speculation as a way of organizing nature. And that begins to call into play a whole set of connections between world money, world power, and world nature. And I think that gives us a different set of demands, a different way of thinking about how to link up demands across the production and reproduction of life. Such as food sovereignty, food justice, the demand for food justice. That food justice is not only about adequate calories. That was the Green Revolution's solution, and it was a non-solution, and it in fact encouraged micronutrient deficiency. So we're saying food justice is not only about calories, it is about nutrition, it is about democracy, it is about cultural determination. And food sovereignty movements are a great example. For all their problems, La Via Campesina and the food sovereignty argument does precisely that. It presents demands that cannot be bought off through a new productivist revolution. But a new productivist revolution in agriculture is not coming. Zero chance of that. Even if we solarize, you cannot resolve the problem, the negative effects of climate change on world agriculture, because it's not just the drought, as our friend over here pointed us out. It's extreme precipitation. It's the drying of aquifers, of glaciers. You can bring in
scrambling of patterns.
Yes, which, I mean, for those of you who garden and farm, you know, key questions: when do the frosts come? When don't they come? How much does it rain? Does it rain a little, a lot, just right? When do you plant? When do you harvest? And climate change messes all of that up in a fundamental way, and that is what the modern world is built on. More and more food with less and less calories, and I mean more and more food, more and more calories with less and less labor, and that's huge for our thinking about politics.
The one thing I would say is, I mean, people have to figure out what to do through the struggles, right? And I know you have a long history of tremendous activism. I mean, the one thing I think that we have to get serious with under President Trump is, big movements that overlook little differences. And the cultural campus left, not to sound like, one of these deplorable types, but there really is a problem with a kind of cargo cult retreat from aiming big and, being willing to work with people that you're not going to agree with on lots of different issues around the issues that you do agree with. Like there's a Christian fundamentalist environmental element, right? If we were serious about this, we would be working with these people. We would, be pushing them on their other politics that are horrible around, reproductive rights, et cetera, but we would not, refuse to collaborate with people who don't agree on everything, because if the price of admission is that everybody has to agree on every little thing, there's not going to be a huge mass movement. It's just not going to happen.
Thank you, everyone.
You done?
We're not finished. That was just just a few more comments.
All right, we got a little more time here. Wonderful.
And thanks for doing what you do. Jean Stein was here last week, by the way, and she's green energy. And I want to thank people like her and Ralph Nathan's out there. What social entrepreneurial companies would you say we should look to invest in and make sure that when they produce a product like this, a new thing coming out with solar panels that look like roofs that are in the making, just make sure that they continue to get the green light so that solar energy can be used?
I don't know. That's a very specific question. I don't know what companies you should invest
in. But can we just point out that all big energy transitions in world history have been backed by the state? So I think this is Christian's point about solarization, even in a bourgeois sense, that let's get the state to bankroll that in the same way that it bankrolled the Texas oil fields and the Eisenhower Interstate and the railroads before that. There are all sorts of contradictions in there, and it makes me uncomfortable to say that. But we do indeed need to find messy politics to deal with the climate emergency that aren't authoritarian politics.
I mean, I don't put much stock in social entrepreneurship. I actually think it's highly problematic. It's sort of, it confuses people, and if you want to make some money, if you got a little money and you want to invest in something, that's a question of I don't know what firm you do, but where are we going to invest our money is not how an energy transition would happen. That would be at the level of state policy, as Jason was just saying. And one of the key things would be what does the government consume, right? Public sector is a huge part of the economy. If the state committed to buying electric vehicles and clean energy for its buildings, that would create economies of scale that would push the private sector to build out these infrastructures, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that's the transition is at that level, not at where we put our money. And the whole social entrepreneurship, corporate social responsibility discourse is by and large a bullshit discourse. And if you get into that literature, you realize it's really thin in terms of facts and ground truthing these examples. I've done a little bit of this as a journalist, looking into the response to child labor and chocolate. I mean, it's a level of just shambolic fraud that's comical.
So go to where there are some responsible people who are taking charge. Where are they? Where are we? If we don't exist, we got a problem.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is that all entrepreneurial activity effectively is governed by the law of value through principles of shareholder value, and so you're disciplined by Goldman Sachs essentially. But also let's not fool ourselves that the problems of CO2 emissions are not just that of transport and industry. Taken together, forestry, which is largely forest clearing, and agriculture is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so we do have to put food and agriculture at the center because food and agriculture can not only stop emitting CO2 emissions, but become a net sink for CO2 concentrations. And so we are going to have to rethink fundamentally our relationship with food and agriculture.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I work with the Anthropocene in Mexico and allies of agroecology and agriculture, and I think that they, out of any left movement or platform, have offered the most grounded solutions to the way forward in facing climate change and taking concerns with climate change with Marxist struggle. But I'm a little confused because for me and in our experience working with these movements, they're definitely leaning more towards Jim Scott's anarchist squint than investing in states, especially in places like Mexico or the majority of the world where states are failed states. They do not function in the way that they barely function in the US. I think that it's a sham that we think that the state functions here, and the elections are revealing that, and it's only going to get worse. And to look towards these movements and seeing how they've resisted and how they've survived and addressed the question of survival using agroecology without state support is important and needs to be thought about.
Oh, it's thought about a lot. It's the dominant position. Look, you got to look at, a place like Bolivia. Where has the left had the most traction? Where it takes state power. Where movements can crystallize and institutionalize their victories as laws, right? I mean, this anarchist vision is, I think, bankrupt.
It's not a vision, it's a squint. You have to look at we have to think about agroecology as symbiosis, creating...
No, I know that, and we have to have this scale up through state policies. It has to go beyond. It has to go beyond. It has to go beyond boutique projects. I mean, this is this is the problem. I'm sorry. This is why.
Farmers are practicing agroecology. It's not boutique. We're not talking about permaculture or organic certification.
Yes, and where they do the best is where states protect them rather than attack them.
I agree, but that's
okay, so then why are you so hostile to the state?
Because the state that you're defining doesn't exist in most places.
Also, you're doing the thing that someone else did, which is you're attaching this normative thing to a functional state. You don't think the U.S. state functions? Are you kidding? We got 2.2 million people in prison. We have the biggest military in the world. We did this massive bank bailout. I don't like those policies. Do you think they're dysfunctional in their own terms? They're tremendous successes for the ruling class. They're colossal feats of organization. I mean, just because you don't like something's outcome doesn't mean it doesn't work. And as an institution, the state works in this country, unfortunately, in some ways.
Well, let's put the question differently. For the United States, for instance, we have seen, and I'm sure you would agree with us, organic agriculture is big ag. Yeah? Yeah. And because it's part of a kind of green capitalist niche marketing and all this. So what if, you wouldn't have to have a revolutionary state to simply reorient the state power around small...
like Cuba did, right?
Yeah, small agriculture and the Cuban model, exactly. And I think the Cuban model is for all its problems, is inspiring.
They set up state stores. I mean, how did this, agroecological revolution happen in Cuba with lots and lots of state support? Even as they liberalized and allowed profit making and private ownership and stuff like that, they set up a huge structure. Right, of course it's not a reality, but if we're talking about a vision, then this is a vision we have to move towards. Your turn.
Are we at an impasse?
Look,
here?
I'm not sure. I think that there's a both and approach here. I think the state has to be involved if we are talking about the timeframes necessary to respond to the climate change, which we all agree is not only happening fast, but every year, every month, every week, really, we get new reports of how much faster it is unfolding and how much worse it is looking. And it's not just climate change, it's the oceans, it's life, it's all the rest. And we have other folks who can speak much more knowledgeably about that. I see Daniel here in the audience. Hi, Daniel. So I think both strategies are going to have to be put into play. I think La Via Campesina has a lot of problems too. I think one of its biggest problems is it doesn't have a worked out way of thinking about the state, that there is this kind of either or thinking. And so I'm totally sympathetic to what you're saying, and I'm totally sympathetic to what Christian is saying. I don't think there are loggerheads, and I think where I maybe come down more on Christian's side is that a strictly anarchist response, which you're not necessarily advocating, is not going to do it. So we need some way of thinking big and acting big in a democratic way, rather than ceding the terrain to authoritarian politics. And let's remember, in the 1970s, you had Robert Heilbroner, the great progressive economist, saying in response to his vision of the environmental crisis, what? Let's look to China as the model for how to deal with things, and in that kind of authoritarian sense. And I'm sorry, that's not my vision of a democratic politics to respond to climate change. So we need to deal with both questions.
Okay, we're going to have one more comment, then everyone is welcome to stay and mingle. The only way
Absolutely.
we build a movement is getting to know one another beyond what the words about the movement. So, Meg?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, thank you. I teach at Kingsborough Community College. I teach freshman English, and my course, we read Jane Jacobs' The Nature of Economies in the class, and I actually heard about this event from one of my students, who was very much a fan of your book, Professor Moore, and I'm curious about the first thing you said in your comments about the need to name the system, right? So actually that's what happened in the class. You know, we're talking about why the media presents jobs and an ecological standpoint as being mutually exclusive. I mean, that is my first paper, is what is the relationship between economy and ecology. And it's a challenging essay for a lot of my students. And, you know, and this student, you know, capitalism, that's why, you know. So what is it, and I back off from naming that system. Why? Because if I say capitalism, then somebody's going to say, she's a communist, or she's a socialist, which, you know, I'll own that. But it gets in the way, especially as I'm teaching students who don't know the word environment, other than in the context of you come from a bad environment. Okay, that's the way they see the word. These are the definitions that I'm involved in. So I'm really talking like from sort of, you know, a humanities language-based question. Like for me, starting at the conversation at let's name this, I'm totally on board with the relationship between humans and nature and, you know, all of that stuff, and I've done a lot of environmental history, and I also understand that class struggle is at the heart of the environmental movement. But do we want to reduce our conversation, you know, to when we say capitalism, right? Other than a fully fledged, you know, Marxist analysis of what that means, does that just break off the conversation? Number one, and does it also not take into account the kinds of things that you're talking about in terms of, you know, what is the role of the state and things like that in like a larger conversation? And just one last point. So in my class, we go very small, you know, occupy your block kind of approaches, come up with an idea that you want to see done in your community, and students write proposal essays. And the student who's familiar with your work has basically just rejected this. He's like, climate change is going to be irreversible by 2020. You're talking about, you know, CSAs with sliding scale. So maybe to Mitchell's point, you know, do we go small and try to figure out, I'm talking about, what I'm trying to do, where I came to this from, is trying to de-link jobs from wealth or money from wealth. That's where I'm coming from. And maybe that's an anarchic point of view, but my students have been told that if they get this job, when they graduate, they'll be fine. And that's part of that system that you're talking about. So, but why is it important to name the system?
Well, first of all, I wish you were my freshman college English teacher, and you said this really beautifully. And so, of course, as teachers and as organizers, we have to find the language that's appropriate for the people we are speaking to, and for different kinds of audiences, we'll make different kinds of arguments. I think in my comments, I was implicating environmentalism as a kind of culture of avoiding the problem of capitalism. And I think that that's different from when and where do we talk about the problems of socialism or capitalism or justice or not. And then how do we start to help students think through, in this case, students think through, how do we help them make the connection? Some of them, like your student who likes my book, will say, well, it's capitalism and fuck all the rest. We need revolution. And then others need to go through a different process. But the student who says well, it's all capitalism needs to walk through the nitty-gritty as well. So that's our responsibility too. So no, I think the danger is to be doctrinaire. Being doctrinaire is always a danger, and saying that when saying we need to name the system, we do. That is what radicals have always done. Not just about capitalism, but about systems of racism and patriarchy and colonialism and all the rest of it. And yet, of course, there is a dialogue that has to go. And the difference is you are leading them to a deeper, more radical critique, and not shoving it down their throats, and not saying you have to do it this way, which of course doesn't work with 18 and 19-year-olds, or for that matter with 6-year-olds or 60-year-olds. So I think, again, this is a question of, can we have a politics of a meaningful both and to be able to make those connections between the seemingly small and big, because what seems small is sometimes very big, and vice versa.
One of my students from NYU is here, and I've been pleasantly surprised. I feel like that one of the only benefits of the end of the Cold War is that both capitalism and socialism have been kind of decharged, and you can actually sort of use those terms. I've been sort of surprised, but I have, because of my age, this sort of like innate fear of like, oh, if I use this word, people are going to do exactly what you said, like just shut you down. So I describe it very technically, right? It's like, what is there's this world economy, right? It needs some name. Do you, as a student, know what its rules are? I mean, competitive firms, markets, really, it's like, you just explain it, and you don't condemn it. You just be like, people in the know, economists, other people, call this capitalism. What does that mean? Let's describe it. You got Marxists and communists who use this term, and you've got Hayekian free market people who use this term. What are they talking about? What and then just explain it. It's not like you can love it or you can hate it, but let's be clear about the definition. And that is really kind of like an opening into more important questions. So I think that's the way to do it, is to just be like, this is a technical term. You have to know it. Whether you want to run the system or overthrow it, you've got to understand what grown-ups mean when they say capitalism. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.